Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the Climate Change Roundtable, presented by the Heartland Institute. I'm your host, Jim Lakely. I'm the Vice President and Director of Communications at Heartland. The usual host, Andy Singer, who works with our Climate Realism team, will be back in 2 weeks. So if you're a big fan of Andy, as we all are, be sure to tune in for that. And, we broadcast this program live every Friday at noon Central Time. So why don't you just go ahead and subscribe to our channel here, Heartland Tube, on YouTube, and hit that bell so that you get a reminder every time that we have a new show coming up. You'll get a reminder on your phone and maybe even in your email to let you know that you can tune in. What's nice about this live stream on YouTube is that you can participate in the discussion via the chat, and we will put comments up on the screen. And in fact, if you have any questions for our panelists today, we will try to do our best to address them. And so that's going to be on the agenda for today. With us, as usual, is the Climate Realism team here at the Heartland Institute. We have Senior Fellow Anthony Watts. Say hello, Anthony.
Good morning, or rather good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, sir. It's also Heartland Institute Senior Fellow for Climate and Energy Policy, Sterling Burnett.
Howdy, y'all.
And a Research Fellow here at Heartland, Linnea Lueken. Hello, Linnea.
Hi.
All right. Well, I feel like if there's any fans of the old McLaughlin group, I feel like we have so many things to get through today. That's right. Yeah, I like the Dana Carvey version of the McLaughlin group better than the McLaughlin group itself. May he rest in peace, John McLaughlin. Anyway, issue 1 is the IPCC report. Now, Anthony, you're the expert on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. No offense to you,
I'm
Sterling.
really sad that I have that title too.
Yeah, that's yeah, you do it so we all don't have to. But anyway, you wrote a piece that we'll put up here on the screen in a second at climaterealism.com about the release of the latest IPCC report, their 6th assessment. And the title of it is Climate Change 2022, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Now, in your piece on climaterealism.com, you rebutted the IPCC's claim that, quote, the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay, and we'll be getting to that later, any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Anthony, take us through why you think this report is bunk.
Well, I have 2 things to say about it in summary. First of all, from the scientific standpoint, it's the same arguments that we've seen over and over and over again. And they haven't really changed. It's just that they're worse now. It's basically become sea level rise is going to get worse. Temperature is going to get worse. Severe weather is going to get worse. Everything's going to get worse. And it's worser than our last report. And that's basically the message that they have here. And it's all based on computer models. So that's the scientific message. The political message is basically send money or you're going to be toast. Mm-hmm. That's basically what they're saying from the political standpoint, that, we're past the point of almost no return. It's our last chance. But, if you go back through the history of things and look at the times that there have been last chances. Now, that particular graph there that you've got there on the scroll, Jim, that's particularly relevant because this is from Dr. Roger Pielke Jr., who follows this closely. He's a climate scientist, and he thinks that climate change is an issue. He thinks it's an important issue, but he also thinks that the IPCC really has oversold this thing. And he put on Twitter that he thought this was a very poorly done report and not representative of reality. But the thing that he pointed out here is that each time they go through one of these reports, their reliance on trying to scare the public with severe weather is getting worse, catastrophes are getting worse and so forth, that gets more and more attention. And so they're escalating the alarm by trying to sell the fact that it's going to get worse and worse in terms of weather. But we all know weather is not climate. Weather is short-term events, things that happen in the space of minutes, like tornadoes, to hours, like frontal passages, to days, like hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Whereas climate is 30 years, a period of 30 years of change. So they're trying to make climate and weather the same in terms of the public's mind. And they're having some success at doing it because I've seen people, rational people, who have said basically, well, this weather event we just had was actually driven by climate when there's no evidence whatsoever of it. Even in the last major IPCC report, they couldn't link major things like tornadoes and hurricanes and so forth to climate change. Their own publication said that, but they're trying to sell it as a linkage right now, and that's the real failure of this thing. The other thing is their reliance on models. Now, there's this particular model called RCP 8.5. It stands for Representative Carbon Pathway, which is just a fancy word of saying carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the future. So what they're saying is that RCP 8.5 is the worst of the worst case scenarios, and it shows that things are just going to go off the rails in a few years.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the problem, and here's what they don't tell you, and this is the big lie in the science. There's not enough coal or petroleum on the planet to be able to burn to cause the carbon dioxide increase that they're showing in this model. It can't happen. And in fact, there's been 2 scientific papers which have come out and said RCP 8.5 should be discarded because it's not possible. There's not enough fuel to burn to make it happen. But the IPCC is relying on it anyway because it illustrates the narrative they want to put out to the public.
Can I
Go ahead, Sterling.
what I say is the real problem is their own data doesn't support the claims they make. They actually have a great deal of data in their reports, especially the report they released in August, which is the basic science report. And the data that they provide, the survey of the literature, limited though it is to some degree, doesn't support the claims they're making for climate catastrophe and the end of the world, and it's getting worse. It doesn't show flooding is getting worse. It doesn't show or predict that flooding will get worse. It doesn't show hurricanes are worsening in number or intensity. Their own data doesn't support the claims made in this report. And that's what's maddening, is that they talk about the hype and the data doesn't support it. And as far as the RCP 8.5, it's embarrassing that they're still referencing this because it was disabused from the public more than a year ago. When they first issued it in sort of a small footnote, you have to read the footnotes. You have to read the small print. They said, this is not the expected pathway. This is the extreme pathway, not the business, not the business as usual, not the moderate case. It's the extreme one. Now, even then, there wasn't enough fossil fuel to produce it, but the IPCC admitted that this wasn't the one we should expect. Now they're pretending like it is. This is what's going to happen, and this is what we got to plan for. And so that's why we've got to respond with why, with what? The only solution, not adaptation, not getting wealthier, not building seawalls, not finding other geoengineering to prevent disaster. The only solution is ending fossil fuel use. So
yes. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, we're going to move on to another topic here in just a second, but I just wanted to see if Linnea or anyone else. I mean, what I think, Anthony, is a good point in your piece here at climaterealism.com is what you call the biggest credibility destroying factor in the IPCC report, and that's the claim that climate determines how humans live and progress. And this constant, I mean, as I scroll down, if people were watching, Roger Bucky Jr., who is no climate denier. He is no, he is a scientist in very good standing. He just doesn't believe that there's a huge catastrophe coming our way that we can somehow stop.
It bizarro world.
Right. So it's just this idea that not only is climate change harming the planet, but it's happening faster than humans would ever be able to adapt. But as we all know, or everybody on this podcast knows, the human species is very, very adaptable, and we have lived and survived in climates much more harsh than the one we're living in now, especially colder ones.
Right, and we have technology.
100
years ago, if you look at what was the technology to keep warm or keep cool, and basically you had wood fire in the wintertime, or maybe coal, and that was it. You didn't have air conditioning in the summer. And you didn't have other adaptive technologies. You didn't have insulation for your house. You didn't have any of that stuff. And so we're actually in much better shape to deal with any kind of changes long term in the climate or weather than we ever have been. And there's a great graph that was put up every year now in January by Dr. Bjorn Lomborg, who shows that death related to climate-related catastrophes is approaching zero over the last 100 years ago. It was way up here, and now it's down nearly to zero. And that's because we adapt, we warn better for the situation, and we know how to build better for the situation. We're no longer, building flimsy houses in the paths of hurricanes.
Yep. We have better infrastructure. We have better emergency response. We have better warning systems. Everything is better. And so we're less vulnerable to climate. We no longer have to sacrifice virgins into volcanoes to control the weather. Let me,
that would be a great podcast.
On your point, I want to read this because this was written 5 years ago and it's just as true today. It's from Alex Epstein's excellent book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And it's straight on point. It says, quote, "The popular discussion has the issue backwards. It looks at man as a destructive force for climate livability, one who makes the climate dangerous because we use fossil fuels. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. We don't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. We take a dangerous climate and make it safe. High energy civilization is not the driver of climate livability." In the end, we live better now because of fossil fuels, and we are safer from climate change regardless of the cause or source because of fossil fuels, and that's what they don't get.
Yeah, I just want to. We'll move on to another topic here in a second, but I just wanted to ask Linnea. I know you're considerably younger than the other people, members of this broadcast right now, and I wonder if you could give some perspective on maybe your generation's view of climate change and the catastrophe, because you were certainly, I know personally you were kind of immune to the panic, but it's something that seems, the media doesn't let go of it. And it seems to that climate panic seems to still have a lot of social and cultural cachet.
Yeah, unfortunately, I always have to be the wet blanket person when it comes to this subject. I really think that a lot of people in my generation and younger, we've been steeped in the climate alarmism narrative for so long. I mean, legitimately, since we were in elementary school, when we're so young that we really don't have the capacity to build a counter argument. It takes a really resistant type of personality to see through it. And a lot of people, even if by the time they get into high school, are more on the conservative or libertarian side of the aisle politically, people who traditionally will be a little bit more resistant to the climate alarm narrative. I've been finding more and more that a lot of them just assume that it's all true as well.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason why the Heartland Institute does so much work on the climate, is to deprogram entire generations who have been told that every year it happens every year. And we've probably passed, a dozen deadlines of the last chance we have to save the planet. And yet we're still here. And in fact, things are always getting better because that's the nature of modernity. All right, here we go now. Issue 2, White House Climate Science Roundtable on Countering Delayism and Communicating the Urgency of Climate Action. And I'll bring this document up on the screen here in a second. So Sterling, this you're going to be the guy taking the lead on this one. We are now no longer climate deniers. Now we are climate delayers. I don't know if that's an upgrade or not, but I think that term is ironic because the climate catastrophe and the time left to address it just keeps getting delayed by these climate alarmists every 2, 5, 10 years. But here's a quote from the document. This is from the White House. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy hosted a 2-hour virtual roundtable yesterday of climate scientists from both natural and social sciences and other experts to discuss the scientific understanding of why arguments for delaying action on climate change are appealing and how they can be countered effectively. This event is the first White House level convening of experts on the topic of climate delayism and its associated planetary, financial, and societal risks and costs. White House leaders and 17 scientists and communications experts from 11 states and the District of Columbia shared insights. Now, of course, the hockey stick fraudster Michael Mann was there. Social scientist Naomi and his historian Naomi Oreskes was there. I think another social scientist, Catherine Cahoe, was there. But they were going to talk about the historic agenda of the Biden-Harris administration on the climate. The White House said that, quote, "This group knows better than most that there have been for decades and still are forces arrayed against the cause of climate action." And you're looking at a bunch of them right here. "Running the gamut from self-interest and short-term thinking to deliberate disinformation campaigns that are as insidious as they are invidious." Gotta hand it to them. That's pretty well written.
Wow.
And of course, they mean us, of course, and the listeners of this podcast and the Heartland Institute and our allies in the climate realism movement. And proof of that is that the despicable Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was also in attendance. And he can't stop talking about Heartland Institute and lying about the Heartland Institute on the floor of the Senate. Yeah. So with that very lengthy and detailed setup for you, my friend, I may read some of the quotes from the alarmists on this meeting later. But what do you make of this high-level meeting at the White House to counter climate delayism?
I believe it was held last Saturday.
That's right, last week.
So even as Russian troops were killing people in the Ukraine, the White House has a conference not on what to do about Russia, how to help Ukraine. They're focused, as you know, and Biden says it's his number one issue, on climate change. And in this case, I'll accept being called. I prefer being called climate delayer than climate denier, because the connotations of denial are so evil. Mm-hmm. But the question is, what am I delaying? Because I can't. I've stood outside and tried to stop climate change, held up my hands and tried to delay it. I'm ineffective in doing so. I don't have that power, so I'm not delaying that. And neither is Heartland. What they're talking about is we're delaying. It's climate. It's socialist climate action delaying is what we're doing, and I'll proudly embrace that, because the actions they're proposing won't save the earth from any kind of climate change and will make us all worse off. So I embrace that. And their arguments about, whatever our psychological motives might be or financial motives, those are beside the point. The point is, we either make arguments that can be tested and proven correct or incorrect. We either make sound, valid arguments, or we don't. And we do make sound, valid arguments. We present proof. We provide data. It's not based on computer models. It's not based on scare stories or what our policy perspective, what we might like from a policy. It's based on, look, we follow the science. I wish they would do the same. If they did, it wouldn't say that, climate change is not happening. That would not be the case. Climate change always happens. What it would be is that the Earth has... The Earth's not about to die in 10 years. The Earth's not about to die in 20 years. We don't need to be net zero by 2050 to prevent human civilization from collapsing. And if we want to fight, I don't care about what it is.
Even if we did get the net zero, it wouldn't make any difference.
If we want to fight something like sea level rise, if we want to respond to that, we can't stop the seas from rising. We're not, even King Canute couldn't do it, nor can we. What we can do is build seawalls. We can stop subsidizing insurance so people move to the coast and along flood zones, because the seas are going to rise, folks, until the next ice age comes. We can't stop hurricanes, but we can certainly harden our infrastructure so we're less affected by it. We can improve the evacuation routes so people aren't harmed by it as much. We can't change people's hard-headed refusal to leave when a hurricane comes. Mm-hmm. But the point is, there are lots of things we can do to respond to the threat of future climate change, which will come regardless of what we do. They're the deniers. They're the delayers. They're delaying positive action.
Yeah, Anthony, you've been a veteran on the climate wars. I think that's the title of a book by a couple of alarmists at least. But you've been a veteran of this debate for many years, and I see here on the screen that in their closing remarks, White House Senior Advisor Neera Tanden said, "quote It's clear that a variety of special interests have had a vested interest in sowing doubt on climate change and feeding denialism and delay, and we need to confront reality." Blah blah blah. As we talk about at our now 14 international conferences on climate change, where we bring some of the leading scientists from around the world together to discuss the latest data and science on the climate, it's not there isn't a lot of money and there isn't a lot of prestige in actually looking at the data and saying, hey, it actually does not support this alarmist narrative.
It's amazing how many people think that I personally am receiving money from fossil fuel interests to do what I do. And that is absolutely false. I've never gotten a dime from ExxonMobil or any of those folks. It just isn't there. But it's a fantasy that they have to justify their hatred and their suppression policies. And that's really what it's about. They needed something to justify the suppression of the climate skeptic viewpoint. And the climate skeptic viewpoint is really pretty simple. The data and the models are over here on one side showing a terrible future ahead, but the data so far says, wait, it's not matching up. The models are outpacing what's actually happening with the data. And so where's the alarm? And that's really our message here. And it's amazing to me how many people think that we are just simply being paid to have this opinion. I used to be entirely on the other side. I used to think that climate change was a real issue. In fact, during Earth Day in 1990, I set up a program with the National Arbor Day Foundation to get a series of computer graphics out to TV meteorologists all over the country to have them convince their viewers to plant trees to offset carbon dioxide. I believed it then that we had a real problem. But then I started looking at the data. I became a friend of the California state climatologist, and he started showing me some of his data. And all of a sudden, I realized, wait a minute, the future that they're portraying isn't going to happen because the data is not matching up. And that's the problem. That's the disconnect that the climate alarmists have. They look at the future only. They see these computer model projections and they equate them to fact. But they're not fact. They're a projection. They're a forecast. And forecast, they're wrong. I mean, just look at how badly sometimes weather forecasts are botched just a few days out. That happens on a regular basis. And in fact, many operational meteorologists who are in the trenches day to day forecasting weather don't think climate change forecasts are really worth all that much because they know the limitations of these climate models. And the alarmists believe them as if they're gospel. That's the problem.
Well, and I'd like to bring one point here that just struck me is the terminology use that they are using, the delayers, the deniers, all that. It rings so similar to the description from Soviet Russia of wreckers, the farmers and the engineers who weren't keeping up on time with the marvelous progression of this great Soviet Union, were wrecking behind the scenes, were ruining their progress. And I just want to point out that this Marxist idea of politics as a progressive inevitability of it marching forward in a straight line to perfection or something is something that's reflected in the word use and in the policies of these people. So never forget, who the people who are against us are and where they're coming from a philosophical standpoint as well.
You're muted, Jim.
I am muted. Okay. All I said was, that's very good. And we can move on now to issue 3 in my very bad John McLaughlin impersonation. And now we're going to do, I've done better. So now talking energy, that's on a lot of people's minds right now because of the war in Ukraine. Russia's, I think 30% or more of their entire economy is based on oil and natural gas exports. And so while we're trying to punish Russia, we've decided that we are not going to do anything about their life-sustaining export, which is oil and natural gas. China has actually already stepped up and started to buy more energy from Russia, just I guess as a fail-safe. But it's interesting if you look at it in terms. Here in the United States, I mean, we just put out a paper. I'll bring this up on the screen, but we just put out a publication this week noting that Biden's energy policies send $74 million per day to Russia because we import about 500,000 barrels of oil from maybe 600,000 barrels of oil from Russia every single day. And that $74 million every day is enough for Russia to make to buy 20 new tanks, I guess, to support the war in Ukraine. So why we're U.S. dollars, let's just say it. U.S. dollars are helping to support a Russian regime that is waging an unprovoked war and creating one of the worst crises in Europe in many, many decades. And how this relates to the United States energy policy, I have some clips I'm going to bring up that's going to infuriate. I hope it triggers everybody as much as it did me when I saw these, but I'll bring them up. And while I do that, Sterling, maybe you can share your initial thoughts on this entire thing.
Well, it's disgraceful. I wrote about it this week on Climate Realism, talking about Chuck Schumer's response when he was asked about that. He says, "Oh, we produce a lot of oil. We get only 1% of our oil from Russia." Well, 1% might even be too high, but the fact is we get 8%. Mm-hmm. And if you can't get your facts straight, it's no wonder you can't get your policy proposals. You can't design good policy proposals to respond. Under Biden, oil imports from Russia increased by 24% during his first year in office, above what we were receiving under Trump's last year in office. In fact, Biden's first year in office imported more oil than any year in Trump's administration. It was 79% higher than the lowest year under Trump.
That's from EIA, right?
That is all from the Energy Information Administration data. That's not me making something up from thin air.
Official government statistics.
Yeah, official government statistics. His own agency. You can look it up. You can go to my thing. I link to it. But the point is, that's part of the point. Look, he canceled on his first day in office. The Keystone XL pipeline, mm-hmm. which even the Natural Resources Defense Council admits would have delivered 850,000 barrels a day of oil to the U.S., which is more than the 600,000 we're importing under Biden from Russia. We could have supplanted all of that Russian oil if we just had the Keystone. He has done everything he can to not only embolden Russia, but also to make Europe serfs. He's stopping LNG exports. He's stopping new pipelines to LNG. He's holding up the permitting for new LNG terminals. He stopped a gas pipeline from Israel. He's doing everything he can, not only to hurt us, but to hurt Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we talked about that a little bit last week too. And speaking of the Keystone Pipeline, I mean, it says here, this on ABC News, this was Jen Psaki last Sunday on This Week on ABC. The chyron on the bottom there says Republicans call on Biden to restart the Keystone Pipeline. And this is Jen Psaki's, the communications director at the White House. This is her reaction to that idea.
On oil leases, what this actually justifies in President Biden's view is the fact that we need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, on oil in general, and we need to look at other ways of having energy in our country and others. One of the interesting things, George, we've seen over the last week or so is that a number of European countries are recognizing they need to reduce their own reliance on Russian oil.
So
that's
pretty amazing.
That's absolutely false. That's not true. What Europe is doing now is Germany has approved just since the war started, 2 new LNG import terminals. Yeah. They want more gas from us in Australia and other places. They are trying to they're opening new coal plants, and they're trying to buy coal from Australia. They're importing more coal. Now, the fact is, what they've recognized, you got to understand, Europe is much farther down the pathway of green energy than the United States. What they've learned with this Russian debacle, but even before, as their lights flickered on and off or went out, as their factories had to shutter, as their prices rose dramatically, is that green energy ain't what it's cracked up to be. It's not cheaper. It's not more reliable. And so they're going back to good old fossil fuels. And if they can't get it from Russia, they're getting it from elsewhere. She just lied. That's not what Europe is doing. They're not doubling down on renewables. They're doubling down on coal.
Right. Now, here's another clip I'm going to have that Sterling, I'm going to make you sit out this one. I might just mute you because it's going to trigger you as badly as me. And I'd like Linnea to jump in here. But this is our energy secretary, Jennifer Granholm, who I don't believe had any expertise in energy policy whatsoever before she was appointed to that position. This is her seeming a little bit exasperated that people think that that the dramatic changes in U.S. energy policy has any negative effects whatsoever.
But the bottom line is that this president and this administration are looking at every single tool to shield American families from the impact of rising energy prices. And we're working through an energy transition. And we've got to start by adding energy. And the reality is we have to take some time to get off of oil and gas. We recognize this. This is a transition.
So there you have it.
Yeah.
We're in a transition, and
meanwhile,
just suck it up and suffer. You know, this was all to be expected, Linnea.
Yeah.
I have two things about that situation. First, besides what she has just said, another thing that made me nearly bust a gasket this week when I read it was, I think, a New York Times article that said something along the lines of wow, I've totally lost it. No, but this whole idea of getting off of fossil fuels in order to stop our dependence on foreign oil, as opposed to just starting up our own policies and our own fossil fuel industry again and getting that up and running, is insane. And these people keep saying that, Keystone wouldn't have any effect on the prices. This stuff wouldn't have any effect on the prices. Biden energy policy couldn't possibly already have an effect on oil prices. Well, that's either a deliberate misunderstanding or a, tragic lack of understanding about oil futures and how these prices aren't regulated based on, what is happening 10 years from now, or what the prices now are affected by policies that will come into effect 10 years from now. They are reactive to current policy change that will have physical effects down the line. Sorry, I'm struggling so much here for a second.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
These videos have short-circuited my brain. So,
well, yeah. It's just this idea, Anthony, that we're in a transition, and so these guys are actually very serious. They expect us all to just suffer for as long as possible in order to save the planet, and I guess they've just come out and said the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that happened this week in the middle of all this, while we're talking about transition, is what happened with the Postal Service. The Postal Service had a mandate from the Biden administration to replace all of their aging little trucks with electric vehicles. And the Postal Service said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to get regular gasoline vehicles, because they can't have their motto be, neither rain nor dark nor sleet or whatever, and electric vehicles, the mail must go through. The problem is these electric vehicles would require charges in the middle of routes to get the mail through. And so mail delivery would suffer. And they simply said, no, we're not going to do it. And it was a real slap in the face to the Biden administration. But it also points to the fact that the practicality of, green energy and green electric vehicles and all this stuff just isn't there yet.
The mail service, actually, USPS, what they actually said was, look, our service vehicles are 25 years old. We'd like to increase fuel efficiency. We'd like vehicles pretty quick, like now. And we're going to go out and purchase them now. And you know what? There's not a factory on earth that produces electric vehicles. But they did say at an addendum, we've got to purchase 100 and I think it's 130,000 vehicles pretty quickly. They did say we're going to purchase 5,000 of those are going to be electric vehicles. And if you give us $3.5 billion more dollars, we can add to that number. We're not going to replace all the other vehicles, but we can add to that number. I wonder how many more, another 5,000 out of the 130 or 80 they have to get. The point is they're being realistic. They're being run by someone who used to be in business. It's not fantasy. It's not, we make this stuff up.
And that's the problem with a lot of our people in Washington. A lot of the people that are in Washington are career politicians. That's all they know. They've never had to produce anything. They've never had to pay wages to anyone. They've never had to worry about getting supplies. None of that stuff. It just all sort of shows up at their front door because they live a gilded life in Washington.
Well, I mean, you said right. They say we have to suffer, Jim. We just have to suffer. But you know who's not suffering? How much suffering is Jeff Bezos doing? How much, Bill Gates, how much suffering is going on in his household because the price of food and fuel went up?
Right.
Al Gore, John, Mr. Tragedy that we're taking attention, the Ukraine war is taking attention away from climate change. Kerry, as he flies his private jet, he's not suffering. It's everybody else who doesn't earn millions of dollars each year.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could go all the way back to Barack Obama, his infamous interview with the San Francisco Examiner, when he said that under his administration, energy prices would necessarily skyrocket. And in other words, that was the intent. Gas has finally broken the $4 barrier per gallon in the gas station that I pass by every day on the way to work. I saw a story today in the Daily Mail. The headline is "Pain at the Pump. Americans are warned to budget for $5 a gallon gas as oil prices are surging." The average price for a gallon of gas right now in the United States is $3.72, and of course it's much higher in California. It's $4.80 a gallon is the average price in California. That's insane.
Actually, it's gone up now. It's over $5 overnight, literally.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of the plan. I mean, they actually think that we are going to be able to transition quickly into some kind of green utopia in which, we'll all be plugging in our cars. I guess, I don't know how we're going to get the power for that, since we're going to be shutting down we're not going to be building any more nukes. We're not going to be firing up any coal plants. We're going to get rid of natural gas. I mean, Linnea, they live in a fantasy world. I mean, you know how the energy economy in this country works, and there's just no connection between what they want and what they say and what the reality of the situation on the ground is.
Yep. Yeah, we're all going to be riding bullet trains in the future,
Oh, sure.
Yeah. In response to, the current energy situation, if I hear one more person say all we have to do is put in hydrogen pipelines, I don't know what I'm going to do. But, for the fossil fuel point, I don't think a lot of people realize, and people are going to start to realize that fossil fuel refining byproducts that become fertilizers that the entire world uses are already being severely impacted by the increased price of oil. So your food prices are going to skyrocket, not just because it takes much more money to fuel the trucks to bring your food to the supermarket or to fuel the tractors that are plowing the fields, but also in all those chemical products that have to be laid down in order to have the kind of farming technology or the industrial farming that we depend on now. All of that is going to be impacted by this.
It's so much more. I mean, when you realize how many products petroleum goes into and natural gas goes into, chemicals for medicines, all our plastics. Look, I'm sitting here looking at a computer it's wrapped in plastic. It's wrapped in a hard shell of plastic. I'm sitting here looking at a cell phone that's wrapped in hard shell plastic, and then it has a rubber plastic container around it so it doesn't crack when I drop it, which doesn't always work. I have a light shining on me that I didn't have 2 weeks ago that's held up by plastic legs. They're all made from fossil fuels. Now, I should say, with all due deference to any friends we have in California, the fact that gas prices are over $5 a gallon in California almost is a silver lining to all of this to me, because they're the ones that have driven so much of this bad policy. So if they're suffering, I'm almost not too concerned about that. I know this, I'm suffering. When I used to go out last year, I could fill up my vehicle for under $60, and now it's costing me over $80 to do that.
Yeah.
So that's the impact here in the Heartland, and there's a lot of people, that aren't as well off as I am even. So let's be clear, this is killing. This is the administration just doesn't care about average folks, and they aren't suffering, and so they don't recognize suffering.
Yeah.
And they're oblivious. There are over 6,000 different products that come from fossil fuels,
That's
like
right.
petroleum. And, things like ballpoint pens and nylon and, all these things that we have in our lives every day. Computers, the things that we're working on, the plastics that are in these computers, all come from petroleum. So as petroleum increases in price due to strife and availability and everything else, that means everything across the board that we use as consumers is going to go up in price. The cost of food is going to go up in price because the fertilizer is derived from petroleum. The cost of, anything. It'll really start hurting them when their new iPods and our iPhones start going from, $1,300 up to $5,000. Then they might recognize there's a problem.
Well, we could go back, if we don't like plastic and the stuff that petroleum, we could go back to glass syringes. So when someone drops a syringe at the doctor's office, we have to watch our steps so we don't get ourselves cut. We could theoretically make computer cases out of glass and cell phones.
Imagine going back to replaceable bottles, like the old Coke bottles where they had to go back to the factory to be washed. Imagine that in the COVID era.
Oh, goodness.
In the COVID era. Yeah, I hadn't even considered that. I'm telling you, these people have no concept of reality.
Well, Anthony, you have experience. You live in the Dallas area, the Metroplex, I think they call it. I like that nickname. You had a little bit of spot of trouble with energy reliability last February, I believe, in 2021.
I think you mean Sterling.
What did I say, Anthony?
You said Anthony.
Oh, I was looking right at you on the
doesn't
screen.
live in
That's
Dallas.
bad. No.
Well, I lived in California, and so I suffered through energy reliability every day.
Right.
Every summer, yeah.
I mean, we take for granted that when we flip the switch, the light's always going to go on. But people get hurt, and it's dangerous to have an unreliable power grid, and we just seem to be tumbling headlong into a future, a pretty grim future. If you want to talk about being scared of what's going to happen in the future, it's a future without enough energy to power up hospitals, with gasoline so expensive that you have to find another job closer to home.
In the aftermath,
everything on a truck becomes, as you mentioned before, becomes more expensive as well when just gasoline and diesel prices go skyrocketing.
In the aftermath of politicians replacing engineers designing our electric power system here in Texas, 200 people last year died during the winter when our power went out. I sat in my house without power, so I wasn't working, but thank you for paying me anyway, under a bison blanket in my bedroom because the temperatures in my house dipped to 52 degrees and colder at night. So, if this is the way you want to live, embrace Biden and Kerry's alarmism. Give Granholm an attagirl pat on the back. If you actually want a livable society, we got to reject this.
Yeah.
The policies, the climate policies, are much more dangerous to human health than climate itself. That's really what's going on.
Exactly. Go ahead, Linnea.
I was about to say, I think we ought to take some questions probably.
That's just what I was going to say. So we have some questions here. This is from Brian Korolewski. Not too good on my Polish. I apologize. He asks, how easily and quickly we saw how easily and quickly Trump helped the U.S. become energy independent. Any reason that can't happen again? I mean, I don't imagine he means we're going to say politically we can't do it because the leftists in power are not interested. But maybe you can answer that question and try to maybe kind of explain how we got energy independent and were we truly going to be able to be fully energy independent? Because people criticize the Keystone XL pipeline. They say, that kind of oil is not refined into gasoline. That doesn't really do anything. That's for petrochemical products and all that stuff. So, Sterling, why don't you start off with that?
Well, we became a net energy exporter. It is true that we would not end all imports of energy if we did what Trump did to make us energy so-called independent. And that's because of it's politics. It's because of the kind of refineries we have built in the U.S. aren't able to handle certain kinds of oil. So we would have to build new refineries. The only problem, the only thing standing in the way of us being truly energy independent in all the relevant senses is politics. It's not the physics. It's not the availability of energy. It's not the inability to access energy. It's politics. That's the only thing standing in the way. And we could go back to that. Does that mean that overnight we would stop importing all oil? No. Not unless we also built all new kinds of refineries, didn't use, like I said, certain kinds of oil. But as far as volume, yeah, we could replace that. Yeah. Now, how long would it last? I don't know. But you know what? Neither does Biden.
Yeah. Linnea, you're a trained petroleum engineer, and this question seems right up your alley. But and I'll kind of set it up. I hope I don't put you off too much of a tangent, but Jay Lair, who for a long time was the science director here at the Heartland Institute, he told me years ago that we have about 250 years of natural gas right below our feet just here in the United States, and that's a conservative estimate. People don't really understand. And Anthony was old enough to remember, as am I, that we were told that we were at peak oil in the late 1970s, and that's just absurd. So how could we become, and would we truly be energy independent if we actually exploited in a much more clean environmental way than almost any other country on earth, all of the fossil fuels underneath our feet?
Well, I mean, they're talking about peak oil again, and oftentimes peak oil, when they use that term, they're talking about it from an economic standpoint, not necessarily a physical availability or like what's economically producible versus what actually exists in the Earth's crust. And there's a lot of debate. And like we've said before, every time some kind of new technology comes around, like the fracking revolution of the early to mid 2000s there, substantially increased the amount of available reserves in the United States for fossil fuel energy. So every time you make a discovery like that, there's talk about methane hydrates at the bottom of the ocean. There's all sorts of stuff. And it's really hard to predict exactly what kind of volume and for how long it's going to last. But, the reality is it's a finite resource. And as long as it's economically feasible to produce it, we will somewhere in the world. And, energy independence doesn't necessarily have to be 100% reliant on fossil fuels. I would never say, that we should go to an all fossil fuel economy. I think that there's a large amount of arguments to be made in favor of nuclear power and hydropower. The only ones that I really hold in contempt are wind and solar, because I just think that they're so inefficient and pretty terrible for habitat, which is something that I'm concerned with myself. Right. So it's such a deeply complicated issue that really you could talk about forever and ever, because there's so much new technology that isn't exactly provable in the field yet for fossil fuel production, that it's impossible to know for sure.
If everything that we think we have, coal, let's look at coal. Jim didn't mention coal. 400 years of known reserves of coal at current. Well, it's actually more now because we're not using it. This was from about 10 years ago when coal was more than 40% of our electric power. Now it's down to 20%. So that would extend the life of our coal reserves if we only just kept it at where it is.
Right.
We also don't have a shortage of uranium if you care about nuclear. We used to produce it all here. We don't anymore, but we used to.
I'd like to point
we also have about 130 years worth of uranium available in the United States.
But I would like to point out that, I strongly suspect that the government policies pushing wind and solar and pushing electric vehicles actually has a negative effect on the evolution of those technologies. There really doesn't seem very much pressure to make them more efficient or to make them better over time, because the government is perfectly happy with the way it is right now. Just install solar panels the way the technology is right now, all over your house, all over your neighborhood, and it'll be fine. Trust us. We know what we're doing. And I really think that they're doing a disservice even to the so-called green technology by the way they push it.
That's 100% right. Rather than subsidizing production tax credit for wind or solar for current installations, set up some kind of prize like the old X Prize, where they say you have to improve the efficiency of these things by 30%. The first one past the post gets X $1 million. But that's not what they're doing. If you pay people to produce the same product, they'll produce the same product.
Well, I'm going to throw another, it's not really a question, but a comment. And I think it's important for us to address it when we're talking about nuclear. Female Casey Royals fan says, not a fan of nuclear unless you can prevent a Chernobyl. Again, I'm of the age where I remember the China Syndrome movie basically stopped nuclear power in its tracks in the United States. And now Chernobyl, and we just had the attack yesterday on the nuke plant in Ukraine, where it has people all worried. That might have been a really, really close call. I guess we'll learn the truth of that at some point. But, this idea that because Chernobyl happened, that means nuclear power is dangerous. That's a complete
it's all based on the design.
Wrong.
I spent a couple of years in nuclear engineering when I was in Purdue, and before I stumbled into meteorology. And I can tell you that the Chernobyl design was flawed from the get-go because of the way they set that thing up. It was inherently dangerous. It was unstable by its nature. And so the design of the reactor is really tantamount to how reliable it's going to be. And that's true of anything, whether it's a gasoline engine or, a generator system or for a coal plant or whatever. So they know now in nuclear engineering how to design safer systems. I mean, systems that were designed in the 50s and so forth, like the Chernobyl thing, have long since been thrown away. They don't want those ideas anymore. Newer nuclear designs are much safer. And if they go to a different kind of a design, such as thorium instead of uranium, that is even more safe. The fact that we're dealing with uranium as the main driver of nuclear plants has to do with the fact that we had a parallel development. We had the bomb in 1945. And so there was a huge amount of infrastructure invested in uranium purification. And so that got moved over into the energy sector. But the uranium is necessarily less stable than something like thorium. It goes into a fissionable mode much easier than something like thorium. And so we basically have unstable, much more dangerous uranium-based systems because of the bomb. Now, if we went to something else like thorium, we'd be in much, much better shape. Now, nuclear fusion is being talked about, but it's always been 20 years out, and it never seemed to materialize. It's very hard to achieve. But if it ever should be achieved, that will be the holy grail of nuclear and the holy grail of energy production for the future.
But there are already designs that are safer than current designs. China left ahead of us in this. They have the first pebble bed nuclear reactor operating today and delivering power. But Chernobyl was never a threat here because we don't have a single nuclear reactor and never have that was designed like the Soviets designed Chernobyl. We didn't have something like that. Just like we don't have a single nuclear reactor designed like Fukushima.
Right.
None of our reactors were designed on the fly, with no care about workers, with no care about the surrounding public. The Soviets didn't care about the Ukrainians when they built Chernobyl. It's just we didn't design ours like that, so it's not a threat.
From what I understand of Chernobyl, even their shielding designs and stuff were just practically non-existent. It was a terrible thing that even at the time they knew was risky. And
that's because
our
shielding is
reactors,
expensive.
Yeah, and our reactors in the United States do not, from what I understand, and I could be off the mark, but from what I understand, modern reactors that we use in the US and France and other places like that do not have the ability to run away and have a, cascading
Right.
meltdown.
Yeah. The China syndrome was a complete fabrication, in terms of what our technology does. Yes, we had 3 Mile Island, and there was a whole series of failures that led up to that. And Fukushima had to do with the fact that they had a tsunami. I mean, who plans for tsunamis to come wipe out your reactor? But the bottom line is, there was all these people saying in the United States, all this radiation's coming across the Pacific and we're being exposed to it. The bottom line is that you get more radiation ingested in your body by eating a banana with a isotope of potassium in it. Yes, bananas get potassium up out of the ground, including the radioactive isotopes. Put a Geiger counter to a banana and you'll see what I'm talking about. But we have not suffered any ill effects of any of these reactor shutdowns or meltdowns anywhere.
Remember, 3 Mile Island, it was bad, but it's been operating ever since.
Yes.
Right. One unit shut down and the rest of them kept right on producing energy.
Yeah, you drive along the pit. Yeah.
And we have 70 years now, I guess, of a nuclear navy. And you know what? In these nuclear submarines and in these nuclear aircraft carriers and destroyers, people sleep right up against the bulkhead where these nuclear reactors are. And there's no evidence that cancer is increased among the sailors. You can imagine the class action suits the lawyers would be lining up for that. We haven't had a meltdown in a sub like that. So it's like, look, we know how to do this if that's the way we want to go. I agree with Anthony. Thorium is preferred, but we have a large infrastructure with uranium right now. That's not going to change overnight.
Right.
And let's talk because Biden is so concerned about emissions. It's emission free. And yet what Biden did just in the last couple of months is he rescinded 2 nuclear power plant relicensings that had been approved by Trump. So a nuclear plant in Florida was relicensed to run through 2052, I think. He rescinded that, and he rescinded one in Pennsylvania. And of course, Pennsylvania, New York, and New England had the experience of shutting down 3 nuclear reactors recently, and their emissions have climbed. So Biden's just messing up, even by his own standard of emission reductions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we should probably be wrapping this up now, but that's maybe just one last comment on this idea. If you watch the Super Bowl, every single automobile commercial was for an electric plug-in car. The infrastructure is not in place to support this right now. And in fact, Joe Biden said at the State of the Union address that I have a plan to put 500,000 fast charging stations across the country. Even CNN had to do a fact check on that and say, yeah, that's not happening. At best,
Right.
we could get that by 2030. So there's this idea that we could transition to a clean electric future. Where the hell are we going to get the power for it? We're not going to get it through solar.
Unicorn
and wind.
juice.
If you're not, I mean, either you go.
I just remembered that New York Times article thing that I had read that I about blew a gasket over. And that was the person unironically and without further clarification said, it is about time that we move away from vehicles powered by gasoline and start powering them on electricity instead. Where does electricity
does it come from?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And as I wrote this week, a lot of people are worried about asbestos that was used to suppress fires in buildings. I'd rather have I'd want asbestos in my walls if I installed an electric car charger in my garage, or solar panels on my roof with backup battery, because as I wrote this week, they sometimes burst into flames and I can't afford my house catching fire because my car is charging.
That's right. Well, gosh, guys, this was such a great conversation. I know that this show under Andy's leadership is only 30 minutes. Maybe that was that's the design. I'm sorry, Andy, when you watch this, that I let it go twice as long as usual, but we had a very good conversation. I appreciate everybody that watched on YouTube, and everyone who's probably going to listen to an audio version of this on the Heartland Daily podcast at some point very soon. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to the Heartland Tube channel and hit the bell. That way you're going to get a notification every time we have a new episode coming up. Anthony is holding up to his camera the Climate at a Glance for teachers and students. Facts for climate realism, 30 facts. Facts on climate realism on 30 prominent climate topics. That's a brand new publication from the Heartland Institute. We are very close to sending it to the printer. So we have hundreds of thousands of copies of it. And you can actually read a digital version right now if you go to heartland.org. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Sterling. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Linnea. And we will talk to you next Friday. Bye-bye.
Adios.
Take care.